So we're continuing to make prayers and dedications for everyone who's on the front line, whether they're medical workers, doctors, nurses, janitors, people in grocery stores, everyone on the front line. So we're continuing to do that. And also we're continuing to make prayers for people who have been ill with the virus and who have died, and for all their families who've been affected by this. And I think too, the group of people that really need a lot of prayers are parents and teachers. And I've been just wondering, thinking, trying to imagine what it's like to be at home, and maybe you're working or not, and you've got some kids at home who need to be schooled on the internet. And I'm sure there's moments of joy and bliss and happiness, and I'm convinced there's also moments of great suffering and frustration and wanting to tell them to go play on the street. But of course, no one's going to do that. So when I recall my own childhood, my siblings and I were very aware of when things were turbulent with my parents. It was maybe tension between them. You could cut the air with a knife, or maybe they looked afraid. I remember one night hearing my parents asking each other how they were going to pay the income tax. And they had no clue that year. They didn't know how they were going to pay it. And so, as children, we don't have skills or language to process these feelings that we pick up in the household. And then the children get unhappy and sad and stressed. And so what I'm going to offer today is one technique that you can use, whether you're Buddhist or spiritual or not, none of the above. It's quite clear that reflecting on the kindness of others is really a beautiful solution to, connecting with your kids, connecting with people that you know on the phone, connecting with anybody. And so the one solution I'm going to offer is that, instead of getting together with your family and talking about the uncle who's been married 5 times and how you really like the first wife because she played with you and she got to know your names, the other 4 not so much, that kind of sharing in the family, we can talk about what people in the family are doing first that are kind, just pointing it out. And we have a practice here that we do every morning at the Abbey when we're not in retreat, where we get around in a stand-up circle and we start the meeting with saying what we're rejoicing in. And often that kind of rejoicing is pointing out what someone in the community has done that's kind, or someone in the friends we have worldwide, or just something we've seen in the news. And just recounting that story, I think all of us know that this brings, a warmth, a feeling in our heart, and happiness. So I'm going to share a story that you've all heard before, but it's one of my favorites. And I'm going to do an example of how you start with people in your family, because there's endless examples. And I think if you model this as a parent or as a relative or a senior person to a younger person, if you model it, they're just going to remember this and they're going to eventually do this. So, it's not like you have to make it formal and just say to everyone, okay, tomorrow night, Saturday night, we're going to sit in a circle and talk about kindness. That's going to go over like a lead balloon. You make it really informal. Maybe you're tucking in your 3-year-old and, tell me a story. So here's the story. You can get out your blanket, get venerable children a blanket and some cookies. And we're going to hear a little story. Now, some stories you have to edit, because all stories in samsara have suffering. This one does. There's parts of this that have, great sadness, and there's parts that are just heartwarming. So you pick what's appropriate for the audience. So this story started in 2015. And I'll give you the backdrop first, because this really paints the picture for how this is one of my favorite stories. And I get my sister to tell this one to me all the time. Because every time you hear the story, you hear something else, right? The storyteller is different, the listener is different, you get different aspects of the story. Can you tell me that part again? So she and my sister and my brother-in-law had headed off to go and get some groceries in town. It was close to Halloween, like October 30th in 2015. The bigger backdrop around all of this is that less than 2 weeks before that day, my brother-in-law's brother had committed suicide at the age of 45. So they were absolutely mired in, this extreme grief and heartbreak. So they're going out to get groceries as a distraction. And it's a cold and rainy day. It's, windy and just a very unpleasant day outside. So my sister at first thought when they got to the store she'd stay inside. And then she thought, no, I'm sure he's going to forget things, so I'll better go and help him with the groceries. So the minute she gets out of the car, she's swooped by this huge raven, just dive bombs her almost. Now, ravens, if you're not from North America, I don't know where ravens range, but they're very big birds. They've got a wingspan of more than 3 feet, and the adults can weigh up to 4 pounds. It's a big bird. And then she noticed another bird dive bombing this shopping cart that was parked beside the place where you park the shopping carts. And she couldn't really see what was going on, but ravens are scavengers. They're typically, if there's something in a truck that looks like food, they'll pick it out of the back of the truck and they'll start eating it. Like it's just serve yourself. So she thought that was going on because the town she lives in, everyone drives a truck. So she went over, though, and it looked like a little black ball. So it wasn't looking like food. And so on that particular day, she could have just thought, it's lousy weather, I'm feeling terrible, I'm going to go in the warm store and just, I don't care what the ravens are doing. But for some reason, she didn't. So as she got closer, she saw that what the ravens were going to eat and kill in minutes or in seconds was this tiny little kitten, this little black ball of fluff. And so she ran over and she tried to grab it, and it ran underneath another truck. And so she's chasing this little black ball of fluff around, and she kept calling to it, and then he finally stopped and he let her pick her up. And it started to purr immediately. And he was absolutely covered in mud. He looked really sick, and he was coughing. And so when her husband came out of the store, she said, let's go to the vet's office right now. So they did. So they took this little ball of fluff to the vet's office, and all the vet people were just taken by this little black muddy ball because he's so cute. And they just took him back, and in a few minutes they brought him back out, and they said, he's really sick. He's got ear mites, he's got an upper respiratory infection. What else? There's something else. He's dehydrated, and we're going to take some x-rays because we really want to know what's going on. So they kind of said, are you going to pay for this? So of course my sister said yes. And they said, you're going to have to leave us with us because do you have cats? And of course my sister has 2 cats and 2 dogs. So they said, leave him here. We'll phone you the next day and we'll tell you how he's doing. They didn't really expect the little ball of fluff to make it. But he did. So then, of course, the whole time my sister's trying to figure out how to ask her husband if they can adopt this little kitten because they already have 2 dogs and 2 cats. And she was fully expecting, especially given the backdrop that I just explained, that, come on, what are we, a zoo? But in fact, it was my brother-in-law who said, shall we keep him? Do you want to keep him? So there you go. Ownership is guaranteed. So they get a call from the vet the next morning that this little ball of fluff has made it. And the vet said, but the cat can't go home because he'll infect your other 2 cats. He has to be in isolation. And we've got to load him up with antibiotics. So now my sister's eldest daughter gets involved, who lives 2.5 hours away. So the little kitty goes to live with her for a week. So more people are involved in this kindness. And then when the little kitty comes back, the other 4 animals there are pretty disgruntled. Like things are going pretty well until you showed up. But they got over it. And eventually, this little kitty, who was called Boo, really came to be very much in love with my sister's biggest dog, whose name is Bella. And she's a cross between a border collie and a rough collie. And she stands about this high. She probably weighs 125 pounds, maybe, something like that. And at first, for the longest time, Bella, who's quite graceful as far as animals go, would put up with the affection and the batting and all of that until this year. And then the story gets even better. But then there's some sadness because this is a story in samsara. So Bella had a buddy called Nova, and they would always go out in the morning, and my sister didn't know they were going out to play on the road. And sadly, this past winter, the dog Nova was hit by a car and killed. So my sister had to go out and find the dog that was dead on the road. And Bella was in the throes of absolute despair and grief. Her buddy disappeared. They're like, where's your buddy? And from that time on, according to my sister, the 2 animals would often sleep together. So I don't know if you can do some fancy maneuvering here, Venerable Yeshe. But this is a picture that my sister sent me recently. And it's really hard to tell who's who because they're both kind of black. But there's a little kitty on the top, you can see his eyeballs. And you can see that Bella's quite content with the companionship of this little kitty. And so I think it's really important right now to think of heartwarming stories where people go out of their way to help others, to help animals, whatever, and turn it into story time. Because the more you do this, the more your kids will, start thinking this way. And, it's really a skill of starting to think about, who's doing kind things. But kids are like sponges. If they hear it early on, they're going to mimic what you do, and that's the really tough thing about a parent. The second hardest job in the world in my books. The first one is being an abbess and being a spiritual teacher, but that's a BBC for another time. But really, being a parent is so challenging. And parents, I think, need all the help you can get. So if this is going to be helpful, I hope it is. Sharing stories. Start with your family. Start with people that your kids are noticing. Maybe they're, reading stories about sports heroes who are doing kind things for poor kids in other parts of the world. But make this a ritual at home. Start off really low key. Maybe it's at bedtime when you're tucking in your little loved one. Maybe it's on the phone with your grandmother who's isolated and by herself. But let's do that. And let's really keep in mind these very, very kind, endless moments that we're surrounded by.